Willful Virgin by Marilyn Frye. Part 1. Lesbian Feminist in the Academy. Essay number 5. The Possibility of Feminist Theory, 1990. Imagine that a single individual had written up an exhaustive description of a sedated elephant as observed from one spot for 1 hour and then, with delighted self-satisfaction, had heralded that achievement as a complete, accurate, and profound account of the elephant. Androcentrism of the accumulated philosophy and science of the quote-unquote Western world is like that. A few men have, with little satisfaction, told the story of the world and human experience, have created what pretends to be progressively a more and more complete, accurate, and profound account of what they call, quote-unquote, man and his world. The man, whose incomplete story this turns out to be, a species of males to which there is awkwardly, problematically, and paradoxically appended a subspecies or ultraspecies of individuals which men are born of, but which men are not. It is, to put it mildly, a story which does not fit women and which women do not fit. In the light of what is generally considered common knowledge, i.e., the official story of man and his world, a great deal of most women's experience appear anomalous, discrepant, idiosyncratic, chaotic, quote-unquote crazy. In that dim light, our lives are to a great extent either unintelligible or intelligible only as a pathological or degenerate. As long as each woman thinks that her experience alone is thus discrepant, she tends to trust and receive wisdom and distrust her own senses and judgment. For instance, she will believe that her quote-unquote inexplicable pain is imaginary, a phantasm. It is in the consciousness-raising conversations among women, however intentionally or unintentionally joined, that women discover that similar quote-unquote anomalies occur in most of their lives, and that those quote-unquote anomalies take another form of pattern, or many patterns. The fragments, which were each woman's singular oddities, often previously perceived as her own faults or defects, are collectively perceived to fit together into a coherent whole. The happy side of this is that we learn we are not sick or monstrous, and we learn to trust our perception. The unhappy side is that the coherent whole we discover is a pattern of oppression. Women's lives are full and overflowing with the evidence of the imbalanced disruption of woes and wealth as between the women and the men of each class, race, and circumstance. In consciousness raising, the data coalesces into knowledge of the oppression of women by men. When women's experience is made intelligible in the communications of consciousness raising, we can recognize that it is in the structures of men's stories of the world that women don't make sense, that our own experience, collectively and jointly associated, can generate a picture of ourselves and the world within which we are intelligible. The consciousness-raising process reveals us to ourselves as authoritative perceivers, which are neither men nor the fantastical, impossible feminine beings which populate the man's world story. Our existence is not inherently paradoxical or problematic. Our existence is an indigestible mass of discrepant data for the patriarchal world story. From the point of view of the discrepant data, that story appears appallingly partial and distorted. It seems a childish and fantastic, albeit dangerous, fiction. Assuming our perceptual authority, we have undertaken, as we must, to rewrite the world. The project of feminist theory is to write a new encyclopedia. It's titled The World According to Women. The historically dominant quote-unquote Western man-made world story claims universality and objectivity, but, from the point of view of feminists, conspicuously lacks both. Thinking to improve upon that story, we assumed ours should be both. By adding voices to the conversation, we expect we should achieve a broader consensus in the intersubjective agreement that justifies the claim to objectivity, and thus also a grounding for legitimate universalization. As most introductory philosophy textbooks will tell you, the quote unquote Western tradition of philosophy presupposes the intelligibility of the universe. The doctrine, the it and we, human beings, are such that it can be understood by us. The human knower, in principle, any human knower, can, in principle, understand the universe. This presupposes a fundamental uniformity of human knowers such that in principle any knower is interchangeable with any other knower. In practice, it means that as you add to the group whose intersubjective agreement will count as objectivity, you are adding pieces of a single and coherent cosmic jigsaw puzzle. You may not know where the pieces fit, but you presume it is possible that any of them do not fit. It is not possible that any of them do not fit. Non-congruence of observations either is merely apparent or is due to observers' mistakes or errors which are themselves ultimately explicable, ultimately congruent with the rest of the world picture. Buying this body of doctrine, one thinks all knowers are essentially alike, that is, are essentially like oneself. One thinks, then, that one can speak not just as oneself, but as a human being. For feminist thinkers of the present era, the first and most fundamental act of our own emancipation was granting ourselves authority as perceivers, and we accomplished that act by discovering agreement in the experiences and perceptions of women. It makes sense that when the feminist thinker assumes her authority as a knower, she would claim her equal perceptual rights in the pseudo-democracy of the interchangeable knowers of the intelligible universe. It makes sense that she would carry over the assumption that all knowers are essentially alike into the supposition that all humans, similarly positioned, in this case as women in patriarchy, have in principle as knowers the same knowledge. She would think she could speak not just as herself, but as a woman. The New World writers had first to overcome the deceptions and distortions which made us unknown to ourselves. We have made remarkable progress. Many of us have rewritten many chapters of our own lives and are living lives neither we nor our mothers could have imagined possible or even imagined at all. We have deconstructed canons, reperiodized history, revised language, dissolved disciplines, added a huge cast of characters, and broken most of the rules of logic and good taste. But we have also discovered our own vast ignorance of other women of our own time. We have repeatedly discovered that we have overlooked or misunderstood the truths of the experience of some groups of women, and that we have ourselves been overlooked or misunderstood by some other segment or school of feminist thought. We have had great difficulty coming to terms with the fact of differences among women, differences associated with race, class, ethnicity, religion, nationality, sexuality, age, physical ability, and even such variety among women is associated just with peculiarities of individual personal history. What we want to do is to speak of and to and from the circumstances, experience, and perception of those who are historically, materially, culturally constructed by or thought the concept woman. But the differences among women across cultures, locales, generations makes it clear that although all female humans may live lives shaped by concepts of woman, they are not all shaped by the same concept of woman. Even in any one narrowly circumscribed community and time, no female individual is a rubber stamp replica of the prevailing concept of woman. In the case of the concept of women that prevails in my neighborhood, the concept itself is internally contradictory. No one could fit it. Furthermore, woman is not the only concept or social category any of us lives under. Each of us is a woman of some class, some color, some occupation, some ethnic or religious group, and one is or is not someone's sister, wife, mother, daughter, aunt, teacher, student, boss, or employee. One is or is not alcoholic, a survivor of cancer, a survivor of the Holocaust. One is or is not able-bodied. One is fat or thin. One is lesbian or heterosexual, or bisexual, or off-scale. A woman of color moves in the quote unquote Western world as both quote unquote a woman and quote unquote of color. A white woman also moves both as a woman and as white, whether or not her experience forces upon her a clear consciousness of the latter. Lesbians must reject the question, are you more fundamentally woman or lesbian? And we insist that heterosexual women recognize that everywhere they move as women, they also move as heterosexual. No one encounters the world simply as a woman. Nobody observes and theorizes simply as a woman. If there are, in every locale, perspectives and meanings which can properly be called women's, there is nonetheless no such thing as a or the women's story of what is going on. Schematically and experientially, the problem of difference in feminist theory is simple. A good deal of feminist thinking has issued in statements and descriptions that pertain to women and are not modified to mark distinctions among women. These are the sorts of statements their authors want to be making. But when such statements and descriptions are delivered in public, they meet up with critics, who are women, who report that the statements are appallingly partial, untrue, or even unintelligible when judged by those women's own experience and by what is common knowledge among women of their kind, class, or group. This criticism seems to be, and I have felt it to be, simply devastating. Feminism, the worldview, the philosophy, rests on a most empirical base, namely, staking your life on the trustworthiness of your own body as a source of knowledge. It rests equally fundamentally on the intersubjective agreement, since it is some kind of agreement in perception and experience among women which gives our sense data, our body data, the compelling cogency which made it possible to trust it. It is an unforgettable, irreversible, and definitive fact of feminist experience that respect for women's experience slash voice slash perception slash knowledge, our own and others, is the ground and foundation of our emancipation, of both the necessity and the possibility of rewriting, recreating the world. Thus, it is only by a violent dishonesty that we could, or can, fail to give credence to women's voices even when they wildly differ and conflict. And when we do give them credence, it soon becomes clear that taken as a whole, women's experience is not uniform and coherent in the ways required to ground a structure of knowledge, as that would traditionally be understood. Thus has the feminist faith in and respect for the experience and voice of every woman seemed to lead us into the valley of the shadows of humanism. Wishy-washy, laissez-faire, I'm okay, you're okay, relativistic humanism, or seemed more recently to lead us into the bottomless log of relativistic, apolitical postmodernism, where there are no women and there is no truth, which is not where we want to be. The way out, or the way back in, I think, is to get clear about how the practice of feminist theory departed from the predominantly modern quote-unquote Western epistemology even before some theorists began revising feminism into a form of postmodernism. There's a page break. The world story we have rejected is written in a code whose syntax respects enumerative, statistical, and metaphysical generalization. Of these, enumerative generalization is probably kindest to particulars, but it is so weak that to be true, such generalization must do a kind of violence by remarking the unremarkable and unsaying everything that is worth saying about the individuals in question. For example, I hardly honor my colleagues in the MSU philosophy department by saying that they all have offices on the MSU campus, which is the most substantial thing I can think of that I know is really unquantifiably true of each and every one of them. Statistically, generalization may be the next kindest to particulars, since it is cheerful about coexisting with, that is, ignoring discrepant data. Metaphysical generalization, declaring this or that to be what it is of a thing, threatens the annihilation of that which does not fit its prescription. For example, Women are nurturant. If you are not nurturant, you are not a real woman, but a monster. All generalizations seem unjust to particulars, as is reflected in the aversion people so commonly have to quote unquote being labeled. Generalization subsumes particulars, reduces them to a common denominator. Nomination is denomination, or so it seems. It might seem that in response to the embarrassment of these paradoxes, we should retreat into autobiography or string suitable adjectives onto the noun woman, and many of us have tried both. Speaking as an able bodied, college educated, Christian raised, middle class, middle aged, and middle sized white Anglo lesbian living in the Midwest, I can report that these strategies both reduce one to silliness and generate serious questions about the adjective order in English. More moderately, we might back up to narrowing the subject of our claims to specific groups of women identified by race, class, nationality, and so forth. In some cases, we have done this, at the risk even so of overgeneralizing or stereotyping. But what we have to say, or what we thought we have to say, is not just a compendium of claims about the circumstances and experiences of women of particular groups. Our project is theoretical, philosophical, political. You have to have some sort of genuinely generality to have theory, philosophy, politics. But from the start, feminism has been going at generality in another way. We need to pay more attention to what we have been doing. In consciousness raising, there is a movement away from the isolation of the individual, the particular. But even in the most culturally homogeneous local consciousness raising groups, women's lives were not revealed to be as alike as two copies of the morning paper. We agreed neither in the details of our experience nor in opinions and judgments. We perceived similarities in our own experiences, but we did not determine the relative statistical frequencies of the events and circumstances we found to be quote unquote common. And the question of what a woman is, far from being answered, was becoming unanswerable and perhaps unaskable. The generalizing movement of our quote unquote science is not to metaphysical, statistical, or universal generalization. In consciousness raising, women engage in a communication that has aptly been called quote unquote hearing each other into speech. It is speaking unspoken facts and feelings, unburying the data of our lives. But as the naming occurs, each woman's speech creating context for the others, the data of our experience reveal patterns both within the experience of one woman and among the experiences of several women. The experiences of each woman and of the women collectively generate a new web of meaning. Our process has been one of discovering, recognizing, and creating patterns within which experience made a new kind of sense, or in many instances, for the first time made any sense at all. Instead of bringing a phase of inquiry to closure by summing up what is known, as other ways of generalizing do, pattern recognition/construction opens fields of meaning and generates new interpretive possibilities. Instead of drawing conclusions from observations, it generates observations. Naming patterns is not reductive or totalitarian. For instance, we realize that men interrupt women more than women interrupt men in conversation. We recognize a pattern of dominance in conversation, male dominance. We do not say that every man in every conversation with any woman always interrupts. We do not hazard a guess either as to the exact statistical frequency of this phenomenon, though once someone did a study on it, it turned out to be even higher than any of us had suspected. We do not close any questions about men's awareness of what they are doing of women's experience of it. What we do is sketch a schema within which certain meanings are sustainable. It makes sense of a woman feeling stifled, frustrated, angry, or stupid when she is in the company of men. It makes sense of the women who lower the pitch of their voices and use the most elite vocabulary they can command when they want to be heard in a male realm. And when a man repeatedly interrupts me, I do not just dumbly suffer the battery. In knowledge of the pattern, I interrupt this event. I know it as an act, as quote unquote dominating. Recognizing a pattern like that can also lead out along various associative axes to other discoveries. The pattern of conversational interruption readily suggests itself as a simile for the naming of other abridgments, interferences, and amputations we suffer but have not named. Patterns sketched into broad strokes make sense of our experiences, but not a single unified or uniform sense. They make our different experiences intelligible in different ways. Naming patterns is like charting the prevailing winds over a continent. There is no implication that every individual and item in the landscape is identically affected. For instance, male violence patterns experiences as different as that of overprotective paternalism and of incest as different as the evil in the bikini. As the veil in the bikini. The differences of experience and history are in fact necessary to perception of the patterns. It is precisely in the homogeneity of isolation that one cannot see patterns and one remains unintelligible to oneself. What we discover when we break into connection with other women cannot possibly be uniform women's experience and perception, or we would discover nothing. It is precisely the articulation and differentiation of the experiences formulated in consciousness raising that gives rise to meaning. Pattern discovery and invention requires encounters with differences with variety. The generality of pattern is not a generality that defeats or is defeated by variety. It's another page break. Our game is pattern perception. Our epistemological issues have to do with the strategies of discovering patterns and articulating them effectively, judging the strength and scope of patterns, properly locating the particulars of experience with reference to patterns, understanding the variance of experience from what we take to be a pattern. As I see it, the full reflective philosophical discussion of these issues has barely begun, and I cannot write the treatise which develops them either alone or yet. But I will survey some of the territory. We have used a variety of strategies for discovering patterns, for making sense of what does not make sense. The main thing is to notice what doesn't make sense. Discovering patterns requires a novel act of attention. The consciousness-raising techniques typically promote just such unruliness by breaking the accustomed structures of conversation. Adopting practices designed to give every woman equal voice and equal audience, and to postpone judgment, defense, advocacy, and persuasion, the members of the group block the accustomed paths of thought and perception. In the consequent chaos, they slide, wander, or break into uncharted semantic space. In this wilderness, one can see what doesn't make sense. Incongruities, bizarreness, anomaly, unspeakable acts, unthinkable accusations, quote-unquote semantic black holes. These things are denied, veiled, disguised, or hidden by practices and language which embody and protect privileged perceptions and opinions. But they are often, perhaps characteristically, flagged by quote-unquote outlaw emotions. And a powerful strategy of discovery, therefore, is to legitimize an outlaw emotion. You feel something. Anger, pain, despair, joy, an erotic rush, which is not what you are supposed to be feeling. Everything invites you to stifle it. Decide you are imagining it, or are overreacting, or declare yourself crazy or bad. The strategy of discovery, enabled by the consciousness raising structures, is to put that feeling at the center, let it be presumed normal, appropriate, true, real, and then see how everything else falls out around it. Over and over, for instance, women's pain, once taken simply as pain, real and appropriate pain, discovers and confirms the pattern and reiterated patterns of male violence. Similarly, giving any quote unquote minority voice centrality in the force field of meaning discovers patterns to us. Other strategies of pattern perception are all the familiar strategies of creativity and of self defense. Cultivating the ability to be astounded by ordinary things, the capacity for loving attention, confidence in one's senses, and sensitivity to smokescreens and fishy stories, and so on. Pattern perception and processes of checking such perception also requires recognition that not everything that is intelligibly located by a pattern fits the pattern. A great deal of what I have said over the years about women is not true of me, as critics both hostile and friendly have often pointed out. And much of it is not true of most of the women I have said it to. One reason this is so is that many of the patterns we discover are not so much descriptive and prescriptive. Patterns of expectation, bribe and penalty, which many individual women manage to deviate from to a greater or lesser extent by rejection, resistance, or avoidance. A very significant aspect of feminist theory is an affirmation of the disparity between the lived reality of women and the patterns of patriarchy. In the project of making oneself intelligible, it is as useful to recognize forces to which one is not yielding as to recognize forces by which one is being shaped or immobilized. For instance, there are kinds of prudishness, quote unquote modesty, and shame, which shape women's experience of sexuality. Not, of course, in all cultures, but certainly not in any quote unquote Western cultures. For the women who are not contaminated by these diseases, it is nonetheless relevant to some of the meanings of their sexual experience that many women are thus shaped, that many men expect women to be so, and that the woman who is exceptional in this respect has acquired her own shape partly in resistance to the force of that mold and or partly by some form of insulation or obliviousness, which surely has other interesting manifestations too. Recognizing the pattern and quote unquote placing herself in the range of meanings it sets up will contribute to her understanding of herself and her world, even if she is not a woman restrained and distorted by sexual shame. But in addition to the fact that individual divergence from the pattern we perceive is not generally to be understood as a disconfirmation of the alleged existence or strength of the pattern, there are limits to how much any one pattern patterns. Patterns are like metaphors. Perhaps patterns are metaphors. Just as an illuminating metaphor eventually breaks down when persistently pressed, the patterns that make experience intelligible only make so much of it intelligible at a time, and over time, that range may change. In the case of pressing a good metaphor, one finds out a great deal by exploring its limits, understanding where and why it breaks down. Similarly with patterns. An important part of pattern perception is exploring the range of the pattern, and a way of going wrong is misjudging scope. An example of this sort of mistake that comes from the heart of some important feminist theorizing is in perceptions of patterns of dependence of women on men. Anyone who is oppressing another is very likely exploiting social structures which coerce the other into some kind and degree of dependence upon the oppressor, for otherwise the victim would and could extricate herself from the situation. But the middle white American pattern of coerced one on one economic and psychological dependence of females on males, with limited but real opportunities for individual women's ad hoc escape from the trap, is only a local working out of a higher order pattern. In many cultural locales, dependency is more collective, and or not primarily economic, is more or less escapable or more or less extreme. We can err by taking one local expression of the pattern as itself a global pattern, or by thinking there is no such global pattern because we see that not everyone experiences this particular expression of it that has so far been brought to our attention. Example: assuming that since single women are not economically dependent on a husband, they are independent of men. If the occupational hazard of pattern perceivers is misjudging scope, the remedy is communication. The strategy by which one proceeds to test pattern recognition involves many inquirers articulating patterns they perceive and running them by as great a variety of others as possible. The others will respond by saying something like, quote unquote, yes, that makes sense, it illuminates my experience. Or, quote unquote, that doesn't sound like my life, you're not talking about me. Patterns emerge in the responses and signal the limits of the meaning making powers of patterns one has articulated. A pattern is not bogus or fictitious either simply because things don't fit it, for the non fit may be as powerfully significant as a fit would be, or simply because there are limits to what it patterns. One might consider requiring of the articulation of patterns that they explicitly signal the limits of their powers and applications, and then criticize those which do not or which signal it wrongly. But the similarity of patterns and metaphors is salient again here. When one says that life is a stage, one does not and cannot specify in precisely what dimension and to exactly what degree life is stage like. One aspect of the power of metaphor is the openness of its invitation to interpretation. It casts light of a certain color, but does not determine how its object looks in that light to any particular observer. The patterns articulated by the feminist theorist similarly have the power to make lives and experiences usefully intelligible in part because they do not fix their own applications, but provide a frame only for the making of meaning. Neither patterns nor metaphors contain specifications of their limits. They work until they don't work. You find out where that is by working them until they dissolve. Like a metaphor, a pattern has to be appreciated, but to use. No, appreciated, put to use. You have to run with it. You may outrun its power without realizing you have if you are not paying attention to the voices and perceptions of many women. The business of telling when one is just wrong about a pattern, when one is misperceiving, is very tricky for women in our current states of community or lack of it. We work in a climate of inquiry where a mainstream knowledge industry works constantly to undermine our confidence in our perceptions, where political exigencies tempt us to force in unity, and where everything would keep women from forming epistemic community. In such conditions, we operate without clear and dependable intuitions of plausibility and without adequate benefit of the monitoring function provided by a clear sense of audience. It is very hard to know when we are getting it right and when we are off the wall. Our first urgency, therefore, built into our situation and our method, is to be engaged with the greatest possible range of perceivers, of theorizers. What we are about is re-metaphoring the world. We need as many and various perceivers as possible to mix metaphors wildly enough so we will never be short of them, never have to push one beyond its limits, just for lack of another to take up where it left off. It was a page break. The whole female population of the planet is neither speaker nor an audience. It does not have a story. But communications among women, kin, friends, co-workers, writers and their readers, explorers and the audience of their stories, have generated world stories in which the lives and fates of humans on this planet fall out along fault lines of female and male as predominantly and consistently as on fault lines of wealth and of tribal, racial, and national identities, and those lines are characterized by women doing more work and controlling less wealth than men, by men doing far more violence to women than women do to men, and by men's world stories marginalizing, reducing, and erasing women. We have not assumed, but discovered, these patterns and their many ramifications. In this discovery, we have discovered the grounds of an epistemic community. It is not a homogeneous community. It does not have to be so in order to ground and validate feminist theory. In fact, it cannot be so if it is to support the meaning making of feminist theory. If a common, but not homogeneous, oppression is what constitutes an epistemic community, what will happen when we free ourselves? First, I would suppose that a common history of oppression and liberation would hold us for a long time in a degree of community, but then, eventually, perhaps, we will fall into a happy and harmless theoretical disarray. What we are writing, The World According to Women, has never been anything but an anthology, a collection of tales unified, like any yarn, only to be successively overlapping threads held together by friction, not riveted by logic. There is no reason to predict or require that it must forever hold together at all. Perhaps eventually the category woman will be obsolete, but perhaps not. Open parentheses. The following is a revision of material that constituted the final section of this essay when I was giving it as talks prior to its publication. Close parentheses. If the world writing project of feminist theory does not collapse under the enormous variety of women's experience and perceptions, but in fact requires differences and variety for its process, why do the differences among us give us such trouble? One reason is that some feminist theorists have ourselves sometimes not recognized or understood our own process, which I think is understandable in terms of our own educations and histories, as I explained in the first parts of this paper. Another set of reasons have to do with the race, class, and ethnic locations of the theorists. Most of the feminist theorists who are best positioned politically and economically to have the widest audience have been members of groups which are generally privileged in Western cultures. The ways our own racism, class bias, and investment in our privileges distort our perceptions have generated both misperceptions of patterns and unconstructive responses to the corrective influences of other women's perceptions. Beyond that, finally, is a matter of voice. The difference between a totalizing, reducing, dominating generalization and an open, friendly pattern perception is not in the words used to put them forth. It is in where they came from and what they are for. And this is expressed and communicated by the voice in which the words are uttered. The voice of the men's world story is the voice of the speaker who does not have to fit his words to the truth, because the truth will fit his words. Things are true because he says them. He does not say them because they are true. The voice of men's world story is the voice whose naming makes things so. If, as Joyce Treblecott has said, the truth is, quote unquote, what you've got to believe, then this is the voice of the one who is authorized to stipulate what you've got to believe. Words spoken in this voice are not really, quote unquote, about anything, but the will and power of the speaker, and thus anything said in this voice offends everyone and everything is ostensibly about, to the extent that the words seem to fit those persons or things, it is only because the words are just reinforcing the will and power that have already molded the persons and things to fit the words. People who have learned to recognize the sound of this voice, but are not themselves authorized to use it, cannot tolerate its pronouncements about them. Everything it says is damaging, reducing, annihilating. Think of women listening to Freud's theories about women, or of African Americans reading the sober social scientific theories about the demise of the black family. Think of how well-meaning white Anglo accounts of alcoholism among Native Americans sound to those who are Native American. Now, Consider the highly educated white feminist theorist standing in her relatively privileged position for speaking and being heard. She has rightly enough assumed the moral high ground in a certain domain of concern. She is rightly delighted and justly empowered by her recent discovery of the authority of her own experience and perception. She is rightly confident of the importance of what she has to say. She knows it is right and proper, epistemologically, politically, morally, for her to be full participant in world construction. In what voice will she speak now that she has assumed the authority to speak? Given the pervasive de facto race and class segregation in which she has lived, and given the education that she had, there is only one voice that she has ever heard that is a voice with authority: the voice of the white male speaking ex cathedra. A likely disaster is that she will not speak in a new voice of her own, but in her father's voice. And if she does it, and if she does, it is likely that many women in her audience, especially those who cannot imagine themselves speaking in that voice, will hear only what is damaging, reducing, annihilating. This matter of voice seems to me not to be a superficial thing. It is more fundamental, I think, than something like using a specialist's jargon to make a point that could have been made in a common vocabulary. A patient listener can, perhaps, with some help, translate the jargon and find out that something useful has been said. But this voice is one in which nothing useful can be said. Useful, that is, to any purpose but that of oppression. Even when its utterances apparently, quote unquote, fit the facts. This is the voice whose nomination is denomination. Is dom. This is the voice whose nomination is domination. It is the voice that accompanies and reinforces the arrogant I. It is not possible to articulate friendly, cooperative, reciprocally empowering perceptions of patterns in this voice. The voice of patriarchal authority drone in the voices of patriarchal authority drone in unhearing unison. For some feminists, one of the things on the agenda of feminist praxis might be retraining their/our voices and ears to register that harmonize and are attuned to harmonies. I cannot say how this might be done, of course, but some ideas about it do come to mind. Voice is not vocabulary, but it is associated with vocabulary, and acquiring voices of our own may be considerably aided by original lexical playfulness and by refraining from rushing to adopt each new linguistic fashion of the Euro-American intelligentsia. Also, a not unrelated point, what voice one can project is surely related to what voices one hears and responds to. We might acquire friendlier voices by listening in friendly and responsive ways to the voices of more other women. A listening that I have already suggested is central to the success of the collective project of pattern perception and meaning making. If some of us are speaking in the wrong voice, that suggests we are hearing the wrong voices or hearing in some wrong way, and that our theorizing will also be quote unquote off. And if this is so, then clearly the matter of voice is integral to the project of pattern perception and meaning making. There is no separation of what is expressed and the mode of expression. For many women, if not for all, retraining voices will be integral to retelling the world.